Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We are a year-round talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, theater, and entertainment. And today we are so lucky to be joined by Zoé Wittock, who is the writer and director of the film Jumbo. And the genesis of this really came from you first reading an article about a woman called Erica who fell in love and married the Eiffel Tower. And you actually had the opportunity to have conversations with her and to talk to her during the script writing process of this. And so I wanted to ask about that in terms of how that really helped you to fill in a lot of the spaces of this story and a lot of the emotional connectivity that you then carried through to the film.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is that when I talked to her, she really wasn't, when I talked to her the first time, I guess she really wasn't the person that I expected. And so that was the first interesting thing. I was expecting someone who was a little extreme or weird or on the spectrum or something. I mean, like, she married the Eiffel Tower, for God's sake. She must be awkward in some way. But really, I talked to her and I was like, I don't think that I would pick her out of, an audience, as being any different than anyone else. And so that was the first surprising thing. Of course, she sees the world in a very different way than we do. But then the way that she was talking about her relationship was so grounded that it just made me rethink all of the sort of prejudgment that I might have had, about objecting sexuals in general and that condition in general. And the second thing is that she would always bring me back to a love story. She would always say, this is just a love story, and this is my lover, and I can try and explain to you in many, many, many ways, but can you really explain why you fell in love with this man rather than another man? And I'm like, I guess in a way, but not completely quiet, So she is like, this is a love story. Just think of it as a love story. I know it's weird, but it is my love story, and I just can't do otherwise. I've tried with men, I've tried with women, I've tried just being alone. It just doesn't work. That's the only thing that works for me, that reassures me, that gives me comfort and love. And so I was like, okay, well, that makes sense. And I guess all those conversations really redirected the film from a film that might have been a little bit more about the exploration of the sexuality and the awkwardness, to a film that was really a love story, and I think that's how she influenced me the most, making sure that this film was a love story. It's still obviously awkward and it still talks about sexuality and identity, but in many ways, because that's the subject of the film. But the direction that I chose to take, both as a writer and a director, was a very sort of tender, emotional direction, and really trying to put the audience into her shoes and into her POV and get them to feel that love story just the way that she was feeling, see and feel that fantasy just the way that she was feeling. And I think that's how she changed me the most in how I was going to approach that subject.
And within that idea of really bringing us into her head and into her mind through the story, it feels like you had a choice in how to tell this. The one way that you could have told this is to make it very lateral and tell it in a very realistic way. And you kind of went more on the surrealist route, which is interesting because that's actually what makes it feel so realistic, because we have such a mind into her imagination and what this connection is, the communication, every level of what this relationship is to her. And I know a lot of that was influenced through the fact that you're also originally from Belgium, and that's a huge part of art to you that you experienced growing up. So how did that really help you to tell such an internalized story by making that very specific and large choice with the film overall?
I think it just freed my imagination, and it's also because I saw it through a surrealist world that I feel I got to understand Erica Eiffel, the person who inspired the film. If I stayed completely grounded, I would always challenge it and be like, yes, it is a love story, but it's not, because it's an inanimate object. But the moment that you start allowing yourself to sort of even put yourself back in the kid's mind and be like, well, I was playing with my teddy bear and it did have a life and it was very important to me. And, sometimes when I see a glass fall, I'm like, is this a sign, coming to me? And I think this notion of surrealism, and whether it's in art, paintings, or film, it's just such an interesting way to express stories, because it broadens the perspective of life and it takes you away from your everyday life into a dreamlike world. And the play on the balance of finding the realism and the authenticity in terms of of the emotional aspect, and then pulling the dream and the fantasy is so interesting, because you'll want to sort of catch the audience with the authenticity, the emotional authenticity, and make sure they carry that feeling into any kind of surrealist scene that you're feeling. So that feeling just gets amplified by the open-mindedness of surrealism. You know what I mean?
And so much of the film really rides on what this relationship with this ride is going to be. And so I imagine that there was a huge amount of thought that went into what is the specific ride going to be. And then even beyond that, you've really thought about how it moves, how it communicates. And I know that you even ended up bringing a ride into a theme park that already existed, because that was the ride that you wanted to have, and even reconfigured the mechanics of it. And so I was really interested in how you landed on that specific choice, and then a lot of those reconfigurations that you did for the communication between Jumbo and Jeanne.
Yeah, well, I guess, the first step was going from the Eiffel Tower to a theme park ride. And I was like, well, the Eiffel Tower is very symbolic and actually quite phallic, but it's a very static object. So it doesn't really, rise my imagination. Whereas a theme park ride, like you said, it has lights, it has movement, it has, it can go fast and slow, it can turn around, it can be big, it can be small. I mean, there's so many different exploration of a ride that you could choose. I just thought that it was just the perfect object. Specifically, if you take a ride versus, the Eiffel Tower, is like, we all have been in contact with the ride. And when we've been in contact with the ride, we've all been taken on the ride, and we've all had to let go and to let our emotional self just take the most of us, whether we're joyful, fearful, anxious, or anything. And so we all have a memory with it. So it's a very universal object and a very emotional object. And then when it came to casting it, you're like, okay, this was great in my mind, but how is this going to look, on screen? How am I going to make that work? And I guess that was a big challenge, but I was lucky enough to have, a great relationship with my production designer, William Abelot, a big French production designer, who was very supportive and like, just look for the one that you love and we'll make it work. And I was like, okay. So I just went wild and I looked at every single ride in the world until I found the Move It 24, which is this ride that we chose because it was big and impressive, but it was not too big and it was not too small and ridiculous. And so for some reason, just because it's such a crazy story on sexuality already, I wanted it to have this kind of manly and, imposing feeling. So I needed it to be big enough, but I also needed to be able to film it, in the same shot, in the same frame as Jeanne. So that was sort of the first complication, and the Move It 24 was perfect. And then also it can move in any direction that you want. If when the ride falls on Jeanne and falls on the character like that with a big hand, like claw hand, it's a little impressive and oppressive as well, and a little scary. But then the moment that you turn it around, it suddenly becomes King Kong's hand. It's like catching the girl falling, and it becomes very comforting. And so the fact that one ride could, depending on how you put it together, can be so emotionally different was just like everything that we needed. And so I guess, every ride is automatic. So when you want to make it manual, it just becomes a whole headache. And we had to call few different engineers and to transform this automatic ride into a manual one that was sort of like a puppet that we could puppeteer around and play with. So we had we rewired it entirely. We changed the 4,000 light bulbs so we had the right colors. We attached other machines to it so we could control it from away. And so we had one person doing the lighting scheme, then we had one person doing the speed, another person doing the movement, another person doing the smoke, and then we had our own lights that we had, as backup lights for the ride. So yeah, it was a huge headache, but a really challenging, fun headache. Because I guess, and then I'll stop after that, but I guess what was really important for us is that it was done live and that it was not VFX, so that the actress Noémie who's an amazing actress, but we really wanted her to have that freedom. If she wanted to pause for 30 seconds, for her to be able to pause for 30 seconds and not to have to go to the next beat because the VFX had told us that we have to shoot this like 1 second and 3 seconds and 2 seconds and a half, you know? So the fact that it was live gave us so much freedom and so much reaction that Noémie was really feeling it and in it as she was acting, you know?
And, you know, beyond just thinking about the movement and the way that you use a lot of lights within that, there's also really intricate sound design. And so when the two of them are together with Jumbo and Noémie's character, it's one of those things where we don't know the words that they're sharing, but you really have a sense of the conversation that's happening between the two of them. So how did you use a lot of elements like sound design and Noémie's performance to really have a conversation that really translates on screen where we know exactly where the story's at every point between the two of them?
Yeah, it's funny because with Noémie, so obviously we talked about what Jumbo was telling her, and what Jumbo was answering. We had talked about it, but when we came to set and we actually came to shooting scenes, I told her just be like a kid and invent and have fun and change if you want. And so obviously she stayed scripted, but she would sometimes change things and suddenly it would bring the scene to life. And I was like, you can do anything. I'll pick it up in the sound editing room. And so when we arrived with all of this, and it already had so much, you know, sensibility to it, but when we arrived with it in the sound editing room, it just became, again, a game of balance, because this whole film totally is a bit of a headache. It's like a little bit funny, dramatic, awkward, authentic, romantic. So it was the same thing with finding the right voice. How do we make it personal and in a way a little bit human-like without words, and keep the anchoring of the machine, you know, to that voice. So how do we find that balance? And so it became about finding the right organic sounds and the right metallic sounds and mixing them together. But it was like just add until we had so much. We're like, okay, let's just strip it down and take some out. And it was, you know, sometimes we'd throw a sound in and we would laugh out loud and be like, okay, this is like Sissy, you know, talking to us, and then we'll throw another one and we're like, oh my God, this is like a scary horror movie. So it was just about trying things, you know, and that's the great thing about today's technologies. You really get to try and explore with a lot of different sounds. So you have like sounds coming from like the inside of pipes, and then you have sounds coming from the inside of a guitar, and then sounds coming from a whale, and then, you know, it's just like really a huge variety.
And the two of you did a lot of rehearsals prior to filming, in which that was actually very much figuring out a lot of the overall like mechanics and logistics of the scene, so that then when you were on set, it could really be all about finding the emotion and figuring out a lot of those details. So how did putting together those foundational details at the beginning really help have even more of a focus on a lot of the emotional nuances in those scenes for you both?
Yeah, I think before even rehearsing the script, it was really about finding the physicality of the characters. So I think we spent more rehearsing sessions on having Noémie Merlan walk around the room and finding different ways of her walking around the room than anything else, you know. So it's about finding her physicality and her voice for the characters. It was so specific. And then once we got into something that was very mechanical almost, because she had done it so much, and we had tried it in so many different improv just to get a different feel for her reactions, we suddenly had a huge toolbox of ways that the character could react and walk and talk. And so that is really what we carried onto the set. Obviously we had, you know, a few read through of the scripts, but it's really that work of physicality and voice that we carried onto the set. And that allowed us to quickly switch from one emotion to the next and try different things and be like, you know, this is crazy, but you're crying in this take, but let's just try to get you to laugh in the next one, you know, and how does that feel? And Noémie is the kind of actress that is very fearless and very willing to try many different things. So we ended up in the editing room with a lot of variety to build a performance on. And so that was great, you know.
And beyond the theme park moments, you really take this relationship into her home, and a lot of the details there. And there's moments where it's a full scene, like when she's in the bathtub and you use the water seeping over and lighting that she's imagining above her head. But then even the production design elements in her bedroom, where you look at the fact that she has all these colored lights strung up, which are really a replication of everything that she's connecting to at the theme park. So how did you really want to take this relationship, which is happening, can only exist in one physical location, and carry it through into her home, so that we really just get the sense of how consumed she is by this at every single moment?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you pointed that out, because one of the biggest challenges of the film was, how do we make the surrealism real, and how do we make the reality surrealist, and how do we mix those worlds? So in the theme park ride, we always made sure that everything that Jumbo was doing was, sure, fantastical and crazy, but it was always grounded in something that the machine could actually do in reality. And so when we went into the home, the same sort of process came by. It's like, how do we make that home both authentic, but at the same time literal up and like full of fantasies as well? And the light bulbs that she has in her home and that you see from the first shot of the film is almost how do you say it? Like initiation for the end, where it's like, preempting that she's already that person at the beginning of the film. She just doesn't know it, and the whole film is going to be about finding that journey to owning up to that obsession, that romance, those feelings. So the discussion with the production designer William Abelot was really focused on, how do we get the colors of the park into the home? And you get them on the walls, and you get them on the miniatures, and you get them on the light bulbs, and you also get, which is something that we don't really see in film, but it was there on sets. It's like, the mother's room, for example, has a whole shelves with teddy bears, and it just shows how both of the characters, even if the mother is very sexual and very woman-like, she is still kind of stuck in some kind of nostalgic childhood as well, and sort of craziness. And the same as Jeanne, who's a character, you never know her age. She's always, very, is she a woman already? Is she still a kid? How old is she? She's 16, is she 25? We don't really know. And mixing those two worlds is what creates the ambiguity that I think is interesting, to move in and out of those two worlds very easily.
And within the romanticism of the film and that journey of discovery for herself that Jeanne goes through, that you were talking about just now, I thought it worked really well in that you never make her question what she's feeling. The moment that she realizes what this is, she's completely self-assured about it. And so you actually make it more about characters like her mom having to come around and understand it. At the beginning, she retaliates with anger because she doesn't understand it. And then there's very much a character arc that you play out with her. And so what are the ways in which you really wanted to make it such a story about other people accepting someone rather than them ever questioning themselves?
It's something that always fascinated me, as a person. So my dad was a diplomat, so I traveled the world with him, and I was always the odd one out, having to adapt to everybody else. And in a way, it was very frustrating, because you had a culture and a community, and then you're coming in, and obviously you have to adapt and understand that community. But at some point, I was kind of lost as to who I was. And I think, finding that moment where you suddenly become really self-assured, and it's not just about you adapting, but it's also about other people accepting who you are, I think was a really interesting moment, at least in my personal life, that I sort of wanted to express through Jumbo, and through that character. And specifically about that subject matter, I think it calls, when you're talking about objective sexuals, strangely enough, they're never really questioning it. It's just everybody else around it that has this pressing desire and need to understand it. And so it's really always more about other people than themselves. And it's the same thing when we define norms. When you're living through something, you don't think about the norms. It's, again, the society that brings you back into a box, into a norm that says, this is crazy, this is too far, this is too much. And suddenly we're like bound by so many barriers. And I've always been fascinated with the idea of breaking down those those obstacles, let's say, but breaking them down and thinking how far and how much further can we go? Because I've been faced with so many different cultures, and I've always had to go further in my thinking to try and understand it. And I just always hope for other people around me to have that same kind of curiosity and desire to understand that anything they know is never certain and is never static. It's always a moving force. And that's one of the things that I wanted with this film. And I think that's why, I focused more on the characters having trouble, the outside characters having a problem with that than the main character, who you think at first is a very fragile character, but is really such a strong, self-assured one that despite the horror of what the outside world brings to her, stands strong and keeps on.
Yeah. Well, I think you've told this story in such like a brilliantly creative way that really captures all of those elements. So congratulations on that. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much.